Hi, today I'm going to be covering my build of this. Why is it called a how not to video? Because I'm going to show all the mistakes I made and the things I would do differently if I were to do it all over again. So right off the get-go, I want to say that this is a very long video. And part of the reason why is I did leave in all my mistakes, all my poor decision making. I left those in there so you can consider those and see what I did different. If you're an experienced woodworker, be prepared. You're going to yell and scream at your monitor as I make some of these mistakes. Because it is so long though, I've left some links, chapter links down in the video description. Plus you can use the timeline right here to jump forward or jump back into any particular parts you want to see. Now, my first inclination here was to build this entire thing out of 3D printed parts. But many of you have told me that you don't have access to a 3D printer, so I decided I was going to build this with no 3D printed parts required. I do actually use a small 3D printed box for the controller down here, but that's not required. You could use a small project box or even hot glue the controller right to the frame itself. I do want to credit Chris Mayer for the design of this. I followed a lot of his video in terms of building the actual framework and the diffusers, but all the stupid mistakes are my own, and Chris isn't responsible for any of those. I will leave a link down in the video description to his original video as well. So let's get started, knowing full well that I know I'm making mistakes along the way. Okay, here are the primary things we're going to need to build the frame. Again, we're going to use 1x2 pine. And as far as tools go, have a miter saw here. I highly recommend that if you don't have one of these, see if you can borrow one. If you don't, you can always use a miter box and a hand saw, but it is important that all of your angles that we're going to cut be pretty much precise and consistent. So if you have access to a miter saw, that would be extremely helpful for this project because things aren't going to fit together right if you don't get those angles exact. I'm going to use a router, and this is a little bit different than how Chris did it. He actually had a sliding compound miter, so he was able to groove his wood with that. I'm going to use a small palm router and a 1/8 inch straight bit for that. A few other things you're going to need is some painter's tape, a little bit of wood glue, some hot glue, and then these are going to be our diffusers. These are what Chris recommended, and they work great, but I did run into a little bit of a problem, which I'll get into. I do think I'm going to try to paint mine, so things like, sandpaper and painting supplies, that kind of stuff, and just some general hand tools and tape measure, the things you would normally need around your house. So I debated about whether I was going to cut my wood first, then groove it, or groove it and then cut it, and I decided to make sure I had a consistent groove across all of the different ones I would groove my wood before I cut it. And again, this groove is going to be to hold that paper plate or that diffuser. So what I've done here for a simple jig is I've obviously got a guide on here. I've put in 2 pieces of wood clamped down, so it gives me the ability to slide my router or to slide the piece of wood through here as I groove it. And we'll give that a try, and I'll come back if I need to make any adjustments. So this ended up being my first miscalculation. Now in the long run it worked out fine, but it did seem to me like it was going to be a lot easier to route these longer boards before I cut them and have to route all the individual small pieces. But as you'll see shortly, I hadn't thought through actually what was going to happen with that groove and cutting the angles. So you're going to see that come up here in a little bit, but this was the first thing I hadn't thought through all the way. Okay, that seemed to work pretty well. A little sawdust out of there. Got one of my sample of the diffuser I'm going to use, and the groove is just wide enough to hold that. So I cut the groove basically centered 3/16 of an inch in, which gives me 1/8 of an inch. I wanted the diffuser as close to the front as I could get it, but I also didn't want to make this so thin that it might have a tendency to break off. So, okay, we just hit our first major glitch. My router bit broke off in the middle of grooving the wood, most likely because I was being too impatient and pushing too hard to try to get them done. So it looks like I have to take a break and run to the hardware store because naturally I don't have another bit that same size. So, okay, after getting back from the hardware store and buying a better quality and a brand new router bit, made the routing go much easier. And I'm sure the experienced woodworkers out there are saying, well, duh, no Sherlock.
I actually grooved a couple of extras because I'll invariably screw something else up, and so I wanted to have some extras. So what I'm going to do next, before I cut these into segments, is I'm going to go ahead, since I'm going to paint mine, I want to go ahead and apply some paint along this inside edge and along these edges, because after they're all assembled, I don't want to come back here and have to try to paint this little tiny ledge and end up getting paint on my diffusers. Okay, I've given each one of these pieces a primer and top coat and let it dry overnight, so now I'm ready to start cutting my pieces. And the way that I've approached this, by the way, sorry if you hear background noise, that's the heater running out here in the garage. It's a little nippy this morning. But first of all, I set my blade angle to exactly 30 degrees. I used a digital ruler. I don't know if you can see that, but it is set to 60 in this case, but it's going to be a 30-degree cut. I took a single piece and just slowly trimmed it down until I got my exact 4-inch width, and then I've created a jig that I can use in here so I don't have to measure each and every one. One thing you have to remember, and I'm sure I'll screw up somewhere along the way, which is why I made extra pieces of board, is you always want your groove on the inside edge. So that means as I cut, I'm going to have to flip this board back and forth each time. So I'm going to make my first cut with the jig and see if we get an exact match with this. And let's give this a shot. Okay, so right now, if I look at this, if I cut like this, I'm going to have the wrong angle. So I need to make sure that I flip this around so that when this cuts, again, it's going to cut at this angle. See, there I go. Right off the get-go, I'm wrong. So it's going to cut like this. It's going to cut like that, and that's going to put my groove on the, okay. Oh, that's not going to work. Okay, I have to try something else. Okay, just realized I made a major boo-boo, and hopefully you can learn from this. But remember, I was debating about whether I should groove first and then cut, or cut and then groove. Well, I should have done it the other way around. Reason why, which should probably be obvious to most of you. So here was my first cut, and again, the groove is on the inside. But you look here, my next cut, my groove is already on the outside. There's no way I can flip this around in any way and fix that issue. I'm trying to decide what I want to do. The only other real option I've got is to move this back and forth between each cut. And then this would have to be moved. And since these need to be very precise and the length needs to be identical, I think there's too much room for error moving this back and forth. So my best choice is probably to go get new pieces of wood and start all over. Okay, I reevaluated once again. And it's going to be a little bit of waste of wood. But that's why, remember I said I was going to do a couple extra of these in case I screwed up somewhere. Well, I just screwed up. But what I can actually do is after each cut, when I need to reverse directions, I'm actually going to have to cut a little piece of this off like this. So that sets the right angle for the next cut. The good news is when I did that, at least my jig is accurate and my pieces are perfectly the same length. So again, I'm going to lose about 7/8 of an inch. So for every 7 cuts, I'm going to lose an inch, but I do have those extra couple of boards. So, and it's going to be more cutting on the saw. I'll do one here real quick. Let me move the camera for a little better angle, but I'm going to have to cut this, then I can flip it over and I can cut my right angle on the next piece. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to reverse that angle so that I've got the groove on the short side. Now I've got the right angle for the inside, so now I can once again use my guide to cut the next piece. Okay, after my first 4-foot piece, I ended up getting 11 pieces instead of the expected 12. Thank goodness I did do a couple of extra 4-foot boards, so I should have enough to be able to go ahead and complete the project without starting over. And as a sanity check, I went ahead and took 6 of these, and this is the same technique we're going to use when we glue them together, but I wanted a bit of a sanity check to make sure everything's lined up and my groove is where it should be. So, in hindsight,
even though I at the time felt like I screwed up, I think this ends up actually being the better technique, and it's probably the way I would do it if I were to do it again. For one, I mentioned the fact that I only got 11 pieces out of each 4-foot segment when I was expecting 12. Well, I never would have gotten 12 anyway, because each board was exactly 48 inches long, and you would think of 4-inch pieces you would get 12, but just because of the width of the saw blade, I would have lost a little bit, and that last piece would have been a few eighths of an inch short anyway. So 11 was all I was going to get out of this. And I think that grooving the board first makes a more consistent groove than trying to route 72 individual 4-inch pieces. So in this case, I think my screwed up actually helped, even though I was extremely confused at the time. But I actually think this technique worked out for the best.
Okay, finally got all the pieces cut, and I'm pretty happy that I've got enough for my build that I'm planning on. Still enough to create a couple of spares and even 3 left over after that. So all in all, it worked out pretty well. Now, before we can put these together, I'm going to have to cut my diffusers.
Okay, to make the diffusers, again, I showed this before, but what I'm actually using, this is what Chris used in his video, are these basically styrofoam plates. And I think they're going to work well. However, as Chris noted in his video, there is a shiny side and a dull side, and we probably want to put the shiny side facing inside. But I have one problem with the ones that I bought, and maybe you can see it. In the middle of every single plate is this recycle symbol. And I actually went out and bought a different pack from a different store, and yep, that recycle symbol is there in every single one. The good news is it's not noticeable from this side, even when exposed to bright light, but it is going to force me to put the dull side down and the shiny side out. Okay, so what I've done to create a template for my diffusers is I've taken one of these and traced the inside of it, and knowing that each of my grooves were 3/16 of an inch deep, I've come out 1/8 of an inch from those lines, which will be my overlap to go into the grooves, and that'll leave me just a little bit of wiggle room, but should hold the diffuser in place. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out, and we'll use that as a template to cut our first diffuser. So I've got my template cut out, and I actually threw a couple pieces of Scotch tape on here just to hold it in place while I'm cutting. But we're going to use a box knife. You could also use something like an X-Acto knife, but you want a very sharp blade so it's going to cut and not tear. And we're just going to carefully follow along our paper guide and cut out our diffuser. One thing to note is that these paper plates are very sensitive to denting. So actually on this one that I cut out, just pushing down with my fingers was enough to dent those. So after the first one, I actually used one of the pieces of styrofoam as a template for the rest. Okay, there you go. There's our first diffuser. So another surprise, just about the time I finished cutting all of my diffusers, and again, there you can see that recycle symbol, my wife came home from some shopping, and while she was out, she found the same plates, but this particular one, shiny side, does not have the recycle symbol. I have no idea why. I actually went and dug the package back out of the recycle bin. So these are the ones that didn't have the recycle symbol, and these do. As far as I can tell, I cannot see any difference. Even the barcode is exactly the same. So I had already bought 2 packs from 2 different stores that had the recycle symbol on the back, but she found one that didn't. So just be aware of that if you're looking to buy these, that apparently some of them have the recycle symbol and some of them don't. Okay, after all that, we're finally ready to assemble these. And to do so, I'm going to follow the exact same method that Chris used in his video, which, by the way, I thought was brilliant. I've laid down some masking tape here, and then I've used the front edge to lay out my 6 blocks to make sure that they are in a straight line with the edges just touching. So at this point, all we've got to do is we're going to put a little bit of glue on one side of each of these. We don't want to overdo it with the glue because we don't want a whole bunch oozing out on us. Then we're going to take one of our styrofoam diffusers, and again, make sure that you've got the side
facing out that you want, because there's a shiny side and a dull side. And now all we have to do really is just roll these up together. Put those together and then bring this extra little bit of tape around. And there you go. And the tape's gonna hold that together while it dries. Okay, so I finished the 12 that I'm planning on using for my pattern. And the good news is I did have enough extras to build 2 spares. So these would be my test pieces for where I can try to test putting a finish nail in here and also figuring out how I'm going to groove the back of these for the wires. So those will be my test pieces. I'm going to let the glue dry, probably go inside, work on the controller for a little bit. Then when the glue dries, we'll come back out and pick up on how we're going to put all this together.
So as I started thinking about how this was going to mount on the wall, the one thing I wanted is I wanted a single cable coming out of the bottom down to my power supply and to plug into the wall. I didn't want multiple wires and multiple cables. That meant the controller was going to have to be mounted on or very near the bottom of the display. So I debated about ESP8266 versus ESP32. I have another video where I compare those with WLED, which is what we're going to use here, and I'll put a link up in the upper corner to that video if you're interested. So if I take a look here at my chip options, on this side are my ESP8266 options. Here are the ESP32. Well, the problem is I like to use these small little boards, and the only option to fit everything on a board with the logic level shifter is the D1 Mini or the ESP8266. For any other option, I have to move up to a board of this size to be able to get the microprocessor and the logic level shifter to fit. So that means instead of a box of this size, I have to go to a box of this size. So if I go with a smaller box, I think I'm going to be able to actually mount this on the bottom. There'll be a slight overlap, but I'll be able to mount my controller on the bottom of the display. This is going to be way too big to fit anywhere and look nice, and I don't want to attach this permanently to the wall. And since the power supply I'm planning on using right now, I may have to change this depending on the total number of LEDs, has a barrel connector. I'll be able to take a barrel connector here and, well, I can show this, mount this here, put the barrel connector, just a small piece of this, and I'll actually be able to unplug the power supply from this and actually remove that and put it away, and also make the thing very portable. So I think that's the approach I'm going to take. Is I'm going to use the Wemos D1 Mini, which is what I tend to use already anyway. Then I'll be able to feed my power up in a single cable that will be able to feed this and be able to feed the LED strips with a point of power injection. So since I made the decision to go with the Wemos D1 Mini, I went ahead and built the base of the controller that I'm going to use. Again, the Wemos D1 Mini and a logic level shifter. I've gone ahead and built this. Well, you can see that. I'll try to get it up here a little bit closer. I've got a separate video that gives step-by-step instructions on how to build this. It's really pretty simple. I'll put a link up here at the top of the screen and again down in the video description that'll walk you through exactly how to build this. I haven't added any external wires yet, my power in and my data signal out, just because I'm not sure exactly how long those wires need to be. Plus, I think I'm going to try something new with this. I think I'm going to try to add an IR sensor and a remote control, and maybe a button control as well. But for now, I think our glue is probably dry, so we're ready to go out and finish putting our display together.
So I've let these dry overnight. I've removed all the masking tape, and after feeling how solid they are, I think I'm going to give up the idea of a finish nail for 2 reasons. One, I don't think it's needed. And secondly, because I'm lazy, and since I'm going to paint these, if I were to put nails in here, I'd have to putty and sand over all the nail holes. So not going to use any finish nails here. I may consider using finish nails when I join these, but that comes later. So what I've done is I've taken what I think are my 12 best looking ones, laid them out in the pattern that I plan on using. And again, you can arrange these in any pattern that you like. But again, I plan on having my controller mounted somewhere down here on the bottom, with my wires coming in this bottom piece. And the idea is to route my LED strips up one side, down the next, up the next, Now, before I do that, I'm going to have to groove the backs of these to allow room for wires to pass. And I also think I'm going to go ahead and just paint all the outside edges before I assemble it. It's just going to make painting a bit easier. I've printed out a diagram and I've numbered each of these, and I'm going to flip each one over and I'm going to mark the top and where I need to cut grooves. Now, I could cut grooves on all sides, but I obviously don't want grooves exposed on the outer edges. I'm going to flip all these over, label them, and then we'll start routing grooves for the wires. Okay, I don't know how well you can see this, but I've just created a little jig here to help me hold this in place. And I used some sample wire and figured to have 6 passes of 18 gauge wire. I need about 3/4 of an inch, ought to be plenty, and maybe about a 1/4 inch deep. And of course, I'll hot glue those in place when the wire's there. But this is one of my test pieces, so I'm going to give this a try and see how well this works. I'm using a 1/4 inch straight bit, so I should be able to make 3 passes through here and get the groove that I need. So let's give that a shot. That seems to be cutting really, really hard. Let's stop and try something else. Okay, I paused that for a minute because I had to mess around with this, and it took definitely more than 3 passes. I think I probably need a new straight bit. Again, it's probably dull. But the good news is that size is definitely going to allow the wires to pass through there with no problem. Again, this backside doesn't have to look pretty because it's never going to show.
So in another bonehead move, I forgot to turn my mic on during this section, but really what I'm showing is I'm showing how I numbered each section, indicated the top, and then where grooves needed to be cut in each one of those pieces, along with which external sides also needed to be painted. I should also note that instead of going back to the hardware store for a new bit, I ended up using the new 1/8 inch bit that I had bought earlier, and it was much easier to go ahead and make the multiple passes with that new bit.
Okay, well, hopefully I've got my mic on this time. I finally finished all of my routing, and I actually did get a little bit better as I went. But what Chris did is he actually used a single strip around there, so his grooves had to be a little bit different than mine. But again, I'm just looking for basically 6 wires to go through each of these. So next, I'm just going to go ahead and paint all of my outside edges. Probably let that dry overnight, so probably come back tomorrow is when we're going to try to put all of this together. Okay, today's the day we go for broke. Today's the day I'm going to assemble all of these together, and this is where I'm going to deviate a little bit from what Chris did as well. He attached each of these panels together with hot glue. He probably had a good reason, and the one thing I'm thinking is it would probably be possible to get the individual segments apart if you needed to or something to realign. I'm going to use wood glue. So once that wood glue sets, I'm locked in. I won't be able to get them back apart. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a handful at a time, clamp them, let those set before I move on to the next. So I guess there's no time like the present. So
this is where you're going to find out if you had any errors in the cutting of those angles or joining those segments together, which I'm soon to discover.
Okay, I've got the first 4 glued together and clamped. I'm going to let that sit for probably about ½ hour until I feel like I can remove the clamps. And then I'll just, again, repeat by adding each section as I go along. Okay, these have had about 30 minutes to dry, and I've been debating back and forth about whether I want to put a finish nail in there or not. And I think I'm going to do that, partially because Santa gave me an early Christmas present.
I'm using 1 1/4 inch 18 gauge finish nails here, and it's one of the few things I did in this project that actually worked out quite well right from the start.
Okay, I only have 2 more tiles to go, but I wanted to stop for a minute and bring up something where there is an issue. I hope it's going to be okay. But by the time I got about the second row on here, I noticed I was starting to get some teeter this direction. And actually, it's a pretty significant at this point, and I think what happened is obviously the angles aren't exactly perfect. As I clamped these, it was pulling the edges up, and so as I moved along, it started creating this bow as I pulled those up, and if there's any gaps, they're actually going to be on the front side. Okay, so finally the construction is complete. Everything is glued and has 2 finish nails. The finish nails worked out pretty well. I'm glad I did it. And I didn't damage any of the diffusers, which is the one thing I was worried a bit about. It is far from perfect. There are some gaps, and there is a pretty significant bow in the center. I'll show this hanging up on the wall, but it's a pretty good gap, but it does go flush on the top and the bottom. So that means light is going to be able to leak out along the sides. And if that becomes a problem, I think I can put a cardboard backer on here, cut some cardboard to help stop that light from leaking out. For my abilities and my comedy of errors that I had, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And so for the next part of this, we're going to start the part that I actually enjoy, and that is installing the LED lights.
Okay, the first thing I've done here is I've taken some of this double-sided 3M tape that I like to use with all my LED projects, because the adhesive on the back of these LED strips just over time tends to come loose, and I've always had really good luck with this 3M tape. So you can see that I've basically applied that around all the inside edges. So now I'm just going to start down here at the beginning and start working my way along the pattern and installing my LED strips. Okay, this might be a little bit hard to see, but I've completed my first connection around here, and what I've done is I've set up a test control over here just as a sanity check as I make each connection to make sure I don't have any problems, because again, the one thing you have to be careful of is make sure that you're following the data direction. So if I get one of these strips reversed, the signal is going to stop. As I go along, I'm going to keep adding strips, and then each time I'll keep doing a sanity check.
Okay, well, it's taken me the better part of a half day, but I finally have the whole first column completed. I'll try to zoom in here a little bit closer on one of these connections. Let's see that. And I will tell you this in another how not to moment. If I had to do this again, I would not do it in this way. I think I would do what Chris did, is I would cut each of these deeper and run a single strip around. Maybe I would go ahead and do connections here and here, but each column would be a single run of pixels. This soldering all these connections in here, not only does it leave a lot of room for error, but it's extremely time consuming. I'm committed at this point, so I will continue on and probably take another day to go ahead and finish these next two columns.
Okay, finally, it's done. It ends up being 309 total pixels, and I think I estimated about around 132 individual solder connections made, which of course is 132 potential points of failure. So now I can finally set this aside and finish up on the controller. Then we'll attach the controller to the bottom, and then hopefully this project will be done. And as I normally do, I always like to do a quick bench test before I start soldering things into place. And the good news is here you can see the controller that I've built, and it's obviously lighting up my lights, and I do have control through WLED. The one thing though is I do have my IR receiver hooked up here. You can see the light is lighting up, so the good news is it is receiving from this, but as of right now, it's not controlling the lights. I've tried a couple different of the IR settings. I'm not too worried about that because there is a way to do custom programming on the remote. But the fact that it is receiving the signal from this remote gives me hope that I will be able to get that to work. So a quick little update before I decided to either throw out the idea of the IR receiver, I decided to try it on a breadboard because I just wasn't sure I was getting good connections on no more length that I had on these pins. So when I hooked up the same IR receiver to another D1 Mini with WLED on it, the good news is it's now responding to the remote. I can control brightness, I can control color, and I also have power on, power off. So, okay, the last thing to do is we have to make some of our final connections on our controller. Remember, we built this earlier, and this is exactly the same as the WLED controller that I covered in my other video. But what we have to do is we still have to make our power connections. Remember, I'm going to have my primary 5 volts coming in. This is one of my test pieces, but again, the hole's in the same spot. So I'm going to need to take 5 volts and ground, run a wire up through here to connect my main 5 volt power. We're also going to need to run our LED control wire from our logic level shifter up here to connect to our LEDs. That's really all we have to do. Everything would work doing just that. That's pretty much a standard controller. But just for the heck of it, I've got a couple of options. I am going to add a push button, so I can mount a push button, probably mount that somewhere over here on the side, where I'll have push button control And all that needs is a connection. We're going to use D3 and a ground connection. That's all we need for that. And then I'm going to add the IR receiver for the remote control. And again, I'm probably going to mount that somewhere over here along this side. Not sure exactly where yet. And for that, we need a signal, which we're going to use pin D2. And we can use either 3.3 or 5 volts. This has an operating voltage of anywhere from about 2.7 to 5.5 volts. So we need our voltage, ground, and signal. So again, our signal is going to be coming off of pin D2, but we also need, again, either 3.3 or 5 volts and a ground. So your question might be, where am I going to make those connections here? Well, if you remember, to hook up our logic level shifter, we ran 5 volts and 3.3 volts and ground down to these columns of pins. So if we look at this side, we're only using one of those connections for our logic level shifter. So I have additional 5 volt connections and ground connections on this side and 3.3 volt and ground connections on this side. So I can tap into those for my 3.3 volts and ground, or 5 volts and ground, and also for my ground for my button. So I'm going to go ahead and wire up those connections, and I'll come back and show them to you after I've got my soldering done. Okay, I thought we'd take one final look at the controller before I mount it in the box and mount it to the bottom of our frame. Again, I finished all my wiring here. Again, here is our 5 volts and ground coming in for our power to our controller. Our signal out to our LEDs, which comes out of the high side of our logic level shifter. On this side, everything is optional, but blue wire is hooked up to D3 with a ground, and that's going to be for our push button control. And then the other 3 wires, the white is our signal out on D2, and I use the 3.3 volt and ground, which is going to run to our IR receiver for our remote control. Okay, last sanity check. Got my actual controller instead of the test controller mounted here. This is going to be my lead for my power supply coming in. Right now I'm using Wago clips in here just to connect everything up together, but I'm going to cut those back and probably use small, maybe wire nuts or something, because this is going to show through the front. I don't want all this wiring showing through the front. Again, I have power coming into my LED strips here. I have power injection at the end, and I went ahead and soldered 2 connections here in case I needed to do power injection midway through the strip, but I don't think I'm going to need that. So we've got 5 volts coming in out to the controller and into 2 spots, and of course the green wire is our signal wire. Let's plug in the power supply here and hope everything still works. All right, there we go. So this is the start of the strip. This is the end of the strip. Can't see it on the camera, but it is lit up all the way throughout. Let me do a quick little check with WLED to make sure everything is responsive. I can turn them blue. I can turn them red. Do different patterns on here. So I think everything is good. I just need to cut these back and probably wire nut those together, and I still need to connect my button and my IR receiver. Okay, so I did want to come back and show you that bow, but there is a decent little gap. So to address that, I basically went out to the local hobby store, bought a big white piece of cardboard that I'm going to trace, and then I'll put a backer on this to help stop that light from leaking out. Otherwise, though, I'm surprised it looks really, really good. The styrofoam plate diffusers were an excellent idea, and those are just about the perfect diffusers to use. Okay, here is everything finally done. You'll notice over here I did mount my button and my IR receiver, and again I do have button control, the ability to turn off and on, the ability to change the presets, the ability to change the color palette. So all that is working. I also have the ability to use the remote control. Again, power on, power off, brightness, color. I also have the ability to select different presets with the remote as well. And of course, there is, again, the obvious ability to control everything through WLED or through Home Assistant. So that's the final completed project. I did put a backer to help stop the light leak from that bow, so I did do that as well. So if I were to do it all over again today, what would I do different? Well, to be honest, I think I would 3D print the parts for this. It took a lot longer, and a lot of my problems all related to my limited woodworking skills. And by 3D printing these parts, all of my angles would have been precise, and in all honesty, the project would have been much quicker. And regardless of whether I 3D printed the parts or did it with wood again, I would definitely change those notches or grooves so that I could use single LED strips at least within each column and not all of those individual segments that I had to solder together. The only advantage of that is I had a whole basket full of a whole bunch of segments left over from other LED projects, and I was able to use most of those, and so those are gone. What would I keep the same? Well, the one thing is these paper plate diffusers. Those worked out really, really nice. So even if I were to 3D print the rest of it, I think I would still use those styrofoam paper plates for my diffuser. The other thing I really liked is the IR receiver. It's the first time I've done that, but I think having a remote as another control method is kind of nice. This is something that my wife would use where she's not going to go into Home Assistant or WLED. So this is the first time I've done a remote and an IR receiver with a WLED, but I don't think it'll be the last. So that's going to do it for this very, very long video. If you watched even half of it, thanks for sticking with me through the process. If you did find anything that you liked or think other people might enjoy this video, go ahead and smash that like button down there. And if you want to see more of my videos, please hit that subscribe button and ding the little bell icon if you want to be notified of my future videos. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.